is the Harrington Chair of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has, for a number of decades, been among my teachers. When I was a Vietnam-era draft resistor and anti-war organizer, Al McCoy's book, The Politics of Heroin, helped me to understand how and why that murderous and criminal war was being fought. I had no idea at the time how the CIA attempted to block the book's publication, or the many prices he would pay over the years for his pursuit of truth and his insistence on speaking those truths to people as well as to power. Maybe like many of you, I often scan the introductions to nonfiction books, but almost unlike any other I've read, the introduction to Al McCoy's new, timely, and very important book, In the Shadows of the American Century, The Rise and Decline of the U.S. Empire, it's a page-turner. In a story that's different from the one I learned from my father, who, like Al's father, was a returning veteran of Second World War, Al describes the impacts of what his father witnessed in the war, his father's work in the military-industrial complex, and Al's elite education, how they created the foundation for his understandings of the world. Those understandings led to his extraordinary career, following in the footsteps and building on the oeuvre of William Appleman Williams, who preceded McCoy as really the seminal historian of U.S. empire for his generation. In his introduction, Professor McCoy also describes how his research into the CIA-backed drug trade helped him to build his methodology that gave us Policing America's Empire, the United States, the Philippines, and the Rise of the Surveillance State. That book provides a really unique and cutting-edge analysis of the methodologies of the U.S. Creation and enforcement of its empire, of its global empire. And now he has gone rather further and deeper in the shadows of the American empire. I won't say much about In the Shadows. That's Al's gift to us today. But I will say that in so many ways, his book is the one that I wish I had had the time and the chops to write. He names and expands on so many of the furrows that I and many others here have been plowing for years. The creation and the reality of the U.S. empire, the geopolitical foundations of that empire, the roles and impacts of U.S. foreign military bases, the roles of alliances and allied elites, the often disastrous CIA and other subversions to put in place or to keep in place allied power elites, the implications of China's rise and the United States' declining share of global wealth, the arrogance of power that has hit really with warp speed in the Trump administration, and the people who will suffer greater than others as the U.S. empire withers or implodes. And should you have any doubt about the pace of the imperial decline, you can look at today's New York Times, where we can read, if I can find it here, Macron embraces Middle East role as U.S. diplomacy retreats. We have recent articles from Germany talking about the necessity of Germany and Europe standing up on its own, no longer depending on the United States, and a major debate going on in Australia as to whether the United States has its power and influence have so faded that it's time for Australia to pursue a much more independent policy. With that said, I'm going to introduce Al. I have to make two apologies. One is that Haymarket Books, who published the book, has not shown. And so you're going to have to either order his books at your local bookstore or over the web. And the second is that Al has to be at the University of Wisconsin-Madison tomorrow morning, which means that we're going to get out of here very promptly a few minutes before 5. So please be patient with us as we have to cut it at that point. So Al, would you please come forward?
First, I'd like to thank Dean Stevens for agreeing to be the person, the sort of impresario that that mediated between Joseph and myself and got me here this afternoon. And also I want to thank all of you for moving your service from your usual morning time to afternoon time to accommodate my travel schedule.
Kind of like it better in the afternoon in a way.
Yes, let's do
Maybe
it.
it's a paradigm shift.
3 p.m. next week.
Maybe not, maybe, I don't know.
Well, there we go. Okay. All kinds of positive things are happening. And I'd like to thank Lorraine and Bennett Hammond for the music. And as I was listening to that last lovely song, I felt something of a dissonance. Within that song, I heard not only a very peaceful song, but a plea for peace. That there was a power, a message that was quite polemical in the midst of all those very soft chords. And then when this banner got pulled back here, which is a banner of people's struggles, of activist campaigns, and I've been an activist in various aspects of my life, going back to the anti.
Or put the mic.
Sure. Sorry. I've been an activist myself in various parts of my life, but that's not what I'm doing today. All right. Today I'm describing not the world as it should be, the world that we'd like to see. Today I'm attempting to analyze the world as it is, the realpolitik of power and empire. And you might say, well, okay, why do that? Because that frames, if you will, our political activism, our opportunities, and our possibilities of change. So today I want to talk about the American empire and its impending decline. And let me begin by talking about why I wrote this book titled In the Shadows of the American Century, and what it might tell us about this rather dangerous moment in world history where we all find ourselves. Thinking and writing about the United States as an empire, the topic of that book, has always been something of an ideological minefield for historians like myself. During the 40 years of the Cold War, the Soviet bloc used the Marxist-inflected term imperialist to damn and denigrate the United States. So in this country, the United States might be a world leader or even a great power, maybe even a hegemon, but never an empire. Our enemy, the Soviet Union, they were the ones that had an empire. So America was an exception, and its historians thus subscribe to a doctrine of writing history that's entered into popular parlance thanks to Sarah Palin, among others, the doctrine of American exceptionalism. But in the aftermath of the 2001 terror attacks and the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the term empire lost its subversive taint, and policy specialists right across the political spectrum began to embrace the concept of empire and ask whether or not U.S. global power was in decline. Yet at the peak moment when its dominion was being challenged, history's most powerful empire was arguably its least studied. Suddenly, understanding the distinctive way that Washington had been exercising its global power was no longer some kind of academic parlor game, but a matter of pressing public concern. For if this nation's unprecedented wealth and stability were based upon its global power, then understanding the U.S. exercise of that hegemony was essential, if not to perpetuate that power, but to manage its decline to allow the most peaceable transition possible. So at this time of major global transition, I felt it was necessary to go back to basics and to try and understand the nature of global power, how it is won, how it is exercised, and most importantly for our historical moment, how it might be lost. Now, to understand our changing world and America's place in that world, we must return to the foundational text for the study of geopolitics. We must go all the way back to a bitter, cold London evening in January of 1904, when the director of the London School of Economics, Sir Alfred Mackinder, a geographer, entranced an audience of the Royal Geographical Society on Savile Row with a paper boldly titled The Geographical Pivot of History. Now, just as a note here, in this single lecture, what he said that night, Mackinder created not only a way of understanding his changing world, but most importantly, he created the modern study of geopolitics, That is, the study of how geography shapes the fate and future of great powers. Everybody that's practiced geopolitics, that's thought about it, written about it, since that speech derives intellectually from Mackinder. Now, Mackinder, in that address that night, back in 1904, argued that the future of global power lay not, as most British then imagined, in controlling the planet's sea lanes, but instead inside a vast landmass that he dubbed Eurasia. Now, in Mackinder's view, Africa and Asia and Europe were not three separate continents, but a unitary landform he dubbed the world island, whose broad, deep heartland, stretching for 4,000 miles from the Persian Gulf all the way to the East Siberian Sea, could only be controlled from its maritime marginal in the surrounding seas. To quote Mackinder, the discovery of the Cape Road to the Indies in the 16th century endowed Christendom with the widest possible mobility of power, wrapping her influence around the Euro-Asiatic land power, which had hitherto threatened her very existence. The greater mobility, he later explained, gave Europe seamen, quote, superiority for some 4 centuries over the landsmen of Africa and Asia. In the Victorian age, the opening of the Suez Canal and the advent of steam shipping had, he said, quote, increased the mobility of sea power relative to land power, allowing the rise of Europe's vast overseas empires in Asia and Africa. Now, as his audience that night knew well, by 1900, the British Navy of 300 warships ruled the seas from a global network of 30 fortified naval bastions stretching from Scapa Flow in Scotland through the Straits of Gibraltar, the Straits of Malacca, all the way to Vancouver in the western part of Canada. But as the Trans-Siberian single track now crawled for 5,000 miles from Moscow to Vladivostok, future railways could, Mackinder warned, quote, work the greater wonder in the steppe, undercutting the cost of sea power and shifting the locus of geopolitical power inland away from the oceans to the inlands. Now, a century after Mackinder gave that seminal talk, another British historian, Oxford historian John Darwin, argued in his sweeping history of empires in Eurasia over the past 600 years that the United States had achieved after World War II its colossal imperium on an unprecedented scale by becoming the first power in human history to control the strategic axial points at both ends of Eurasia through military bases and mutual security pacts. Now, since Professor Darwin, after making that grand statement fraught with meaning, tells us very little about what he means about controlling both ends of Eurasia, in my book I attempted to figure out what he was talking about. And I think he invites us to think about the geopolitical implications of the United States controlling both ends of Eurasia. Now, while Washington defended the western end of Eurasia through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, its position in the east was secured by 4 mutual defense pacts along the Pacific littoral, from Japan through South Korea and the Philippines all the way to Australia. In the post-war architecture of U.S. geopolitical power, these 2 axial points at the ends of Eurasia were joined by a successive arcs of steel around the continent, comprising mutual defense treaties, strategic bombers, naval armadas, specifically the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean, the 5th Fleet in the Persian Gulf, and the powerful 7th Fleet in the Western Pacific. By the Cold War's end in 1990, the U.S. encirclement of Eurasia required 700 overseas bases, 1,700 jet fighters, 1,000 ballistic missiles, and 600 ships, including 15 nuclear carrier battle groups, all linked by the world's only global system of communication satellites. Most recently, the United States has added to that circle of steel by building a string of 60 drone bases stretching around the Eurasian landmass from Sicily all the way to Guam. In the decade after World War II, Washington also built a potent 4-tier apparatus, military, diplomatic, economic, and clandestine, for a global dominion of unprecedented wealth and power. First and fundamental was the unmatched power of the U.S. military, which I just described. Complementing all that steel was the salve of an active worldwide diplomacy, manifested in multilateral alliances, economic aid, and the cultural suasion of soft power, Hollywood, basketball, those sorts of things, the Rotary. That's quite serious, actually. This global security also promoted trade pacts that allowed America's burgeoning multinational corporations to operate profitably behind the shield of American power. Adding a distinct dimension to U.S. global power was a clandestine fourth tier that entailed global surveillance by the National Security Administration and covert operations on 5 continents by the CIA, manipulating elections and mobilizing client armies for coups to assure that friendly leaders occupied 100 presidential palaces worldwide. Now, this covert apparatus was in many ways the distinctive aspect that separates the American empire from preceding empires, because this covert apparatus resolved the contradiction of the age between Washington's needs to intervene overseas as the globe's great hegemon and its new world order of sovereign states supposedly immune to such intervention. So how do you intervene when you can't intervene? You do it covertly. Now, in 2012, at the seeming peak of all this global power, the U.S. National Intelligence Council, Washington's supreme analytic body, issued an unexpected warning about China's impending challenge. Let me quote from this important report, which was generally overlooked by the American media. Quote, "By 2030, no country will be a hegemonic power, largely reversing the historic rise of the West since 1750. Asia will have surpassed North America and Europe combined in terms of global power based on GDP, population size, military spending, and technological investment. China alone will probably have the largest economy, surpassing that of the United States a few years before 2030. My book has collected a few all-important but I think often ignored indicators that reveal the full extent of that Chinese challenge. As shown in the race, for example, in worldwide patents, American leadership in technological innovation is clearly on the wane. Now, going back to 2008, the United States still held the number 2 spot behind Japan in worldwide patent applications, with 232,000 for Americans, although China at 195,000 was closing fast, thanks to a blistering 400% increase since 2000. 6 years later, in 2014, the situation had changed dramatically. China actually took the lead in this critical category, scoring nearly half of all the world's patent applications, filing an extraordinary 800,000 patent applications compared to just 285,000 for Americans. With supercomputing now critical for everything from code breaking to consumer products, in 2010, China's Defense Ministry beat the Pentagon by launching the world's fastest supercomputer, the Tianhe-1. For the next 7 years, Beijing produced the world's fastest machine until 2016, when it won in the way that really matters, with a supercomputer that had microprocessor chips made in China. Now, by then, China had not only the fastest supercomputers, but it also had the most in the world, with 167 compared to 165 for the United States, and the third being Japan with just 29. Finally, the American education system, a critical source of future scientists and innovators, has been falling behind its competitors. In 2012, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, I call it the Rich Countries Club, tested 500,000 15-year-olds worldwide, and the tests are no-cheat tests. The test given in China is administered by Australians, in Australia by people of the country, so no gaming that test, serious test. And in those tests in 2012, the Chinese students, the Chinese 15-year-olds in Shanghai, came first in math and science, while Americans placed 20th in science and 27th in math. Well, that was pretty upsetting, 20th in science, 27th in math. We got really upset. President Bush had already launched the No Child Left Behind. Obama came in and followed that with the race to the top. We spent billions in upgrading and improving American education. So things should have gotten better, right? Well, no, actually, they got worse, in fact, much worse. 3 years later, in 2015, American standing slid further to 25th in science and, I can't believe this, 39th in math. Yes, 39th in math. I checked that, I double-checked that. 39th in math. Okay, so you might say, so what? Okay, I mean, really, just a bunch of 15-year-olds with, braces, backpacks, and we all know it, attitude. Well, we care because by 2030, those 15-year-old test takers will be the mid-career scientists and engineers determining whose computers survive a cyber attack and whose satellites evade a missile strike and whose economy has produced the next best thing. After years of abjuring, of denying any aspirations to power, Beijing's actions over the past 3 years, particularly its construction of naval bases in the South China Sea, have revealed Beijing's subtle two-part strategy for challenging U.S. global hegemony. First, China is launching a vast transcontinental engineering project of sufficient scale to realize Sir Alfred Mackinder's original vision back in 1904 of harnessing the Eurasian heartland as an engine to drive the ascent of a new global power. Second, China is constructing naval bases for severing those circles of steel that Washington, for the past 70 years, has arrayed around the perimeter of the Eurasian continent. Yet even today, 100 years after Mackinder's 1904 lecture, this Eurasian heartland is so vast, so empty, that its development represents a daunting challenge too difficult to grasp by a mere glance at the map. And should we glance at the map, what we'd find, of course, is the surprising thing that we all know continents are unitary, isolated, substantial bodies of land. Yet Europe and Asia, in fact, they're two continents that are on the same body of land. So what separates Europe from Asia? This vast, empty heartland, those distances. So for nearly 1,000 years, from the 12th to the 21st century, the endless distances alone challenge any traveler who tried to cross them, rendering Eurasia's actual geographical unity, in human terms, meaningless. Leaving Venice in about 1270, Marco Polo became one of the first Europeans to travel overland to China, surviving bandits, sandstorms, and wilderness to complete the trek in 3 years. 600 years later, in 1907, another Italian aristocrat, Prince Scipione Borghese, won the first Peking to Paris auto race by driving his 40-horsepower Atala motor car for 60 days continuously to cover a distance of 9,000 miles and capture the prize worthy of a prince, a magnum of Mum's champagne. Now, 100 years later, in 2007, when that race was commemorated, my wife's Uncle David, very nice guy, a retired school teacher from Iowa and a car fanatic, drove his lovingly restored 1938 Ford Coupe in a fleet of 100 antique automobiles on a journey that still took 36 days of continuous driving from Peking to Paris. Now, somewhere in the Gobi Desert, Uncle David became separated from the pack, and suddenly he found himself literally in the middle of nowhere. I mean, he was in this vast empty terrain, no roads, no